The escort line moved slowly along the concrete tier at USP Marion on October 22, 1983, with Thomas Silverstein walking, cuffed behind his back, between Officer Merle Clutts and two other guards. They paused outside Randy Gometz's cell the way they always pause, which mattered more than anyone understood in that second. The cuffs came loose, the metal clicked once, and a handmade blade slid into Silverstein's palm before any alarm reached the end of the range. By the time Klutz turned his shoulders, the rules that kept men alive inside that building had already collapsed. What happened next did not begin that morning, and it did not end in that corridor, since this moment had been building across years of pressure, bad choices, and lessons learned too early. Thomas Edward Conway entered the world on February 4, 1952, in Long Beach, California, into a home that looked stable from the sidewalk, yet already carried fracture lines beneath the surface. His mother, Virginia, divorced Thomas Conway quickly and remarried Sid Silverstein, who adopted the boy and gave him the last name that would later follow him through federal courtrooms. In school, he stayed small, shy, and careful, while classmates targeted him partly for his size and partly for a last name they wrongly thought meant he was Jewish. Every day that he came home quietly reinforced the same lesson, since Virginia believed tears invited more harm rather than protection. Virginia Silverstein did not raise her son with comforting stories about patience or turning the other cheek, believing survival required a quick hand and a hard response. She told him directly that if another boy hit him and he came home crying, she would hit him again to teach him not to lose. Years later, Silverstein repeated her words almost verbatim, explaining that if someone came with a bat, you brought your own bat and finished it there. By the time he reached middle school, violence already felt like language rather than an emergency. In 1966, at 14 years old, the state sent him to a California Youth Authority facility after his first serious delinquency case. Inside that reformatory, he learned quickly that boys who refused to fight became targets rather than students. Older inmates taught him where to stand, how to look, and when to strike, which replaced whatever childhood rules he had left. He later said that nobody in that place survived on manners, since only reputation kept you breathing at night. Drugs arrived early, with heroin becoming routine before adulthood, which forced theft to become daily work rather than an occasional mistake. Breaking into houses paid for the habit, while the habit fed the need for more break-ins, creating a loop he did not know how to exit. Every successful burglary reinforced the idea that risk brought reward faster than waiting ever could. By the time he reached 19, the line between crime and routine no longer existed in his thinking. In 1971, California sent him to San Quentin for armed robbery, which placed him among men who treated violence as a profession rather than an impulse. He served 4 years, learned how to watch guards, learned how to read inmates, and learned how to hide intention behind a calm posture. When parole came in 1975, he walked out older in experience, yet younger in judgment, carrying habits that did not belong on free streets. Within months, he drifted back toward the same circles that had first taught him how to survive. The next robberies came with his biological father, Thomas Conway, and a cousin, which turned crime into a family operation rather than a lone hustle. Across several armed heists, they collected barely $11,000, a small number that still carried 15 years of federal time. In 1977, a federal court sentenced Silverstein to 15 years, marking the moment his life shifted from street survival to institutional survival. When marshals loaded him onto the transport bus, he did not yet understand that his education was about to continue inside a different classroom. In 1977, at 25 years old, Thomas Silverstein entered the federal system carrying habits shaped more by survival than by planning. His arrest followed a string of armed robberies committed with his biological father, Thomas Conway, and a cousin, crimes that blended family loyalty with desperation rather than strategy. Across several holdups, they collected little more than $11,000, a sum small enough to look foolish in hindsight, yet heavy enough to justify a 15-year federal sentence. When the judge imposed that term, Silverstein understood only that street life had finally closed its door on him. What he did not yet understand was that prison life would teach him a different set of rules that no court ever explained. The transport bus delivered him to the United States Penitentiary at Leavenworth, Kansas, a prison that functioned as a city governed by customs older than any statute book. From the first day, he learned that classification by race determined safety more than classification by crime. White inmates moved together, black inmates formed their own alliances, and men who tried to remain neutral rarely lasted long without protection. Guards explained procedures, yet inmates explained survival, and those lessons came faster and with more clarity. In that environment, choosing not to choose a side counted as a choice that usually ended badly. Silverstein gravitated toward white inmates who controlled certain tiers, partly from instinct and partly from fear of standing alone. Over weeks, those associations hardened into affiliation with the Aryan Brotherhood, a prison gang that offered protection in exchange for loyalty and discipline. Tattoos marked membership, yet behavior mattered more than symbols, since every member was expected to contribute to the group's stability. He learned quickly that protection did not come free, and that refusing an order carried consequences nobody needed to describe twice. Inside Leavenworth, survival required obedience long before it required courage. Daily life revolved around routine, with counts, meals, work assignments, and lockdowns shaping every hour. Silverstein worked prison jobs, learned how to watch guards, and learned how to read other inmates without asking questions. He listened more than he spoke, storing information about movement patterns, blind spots, and the unspoken rules that governed each cell block. Violence existed, yet it arrived less often than rumor, which carried warnings long before fists ever flew. In those early months, he focused on staying unnoticed rather than proving anything to anyone. The prison economy already moved quietly beneath official operations, built around cigarettes, food, and small favors rather than large criminal schemes. Silverstein observed those networks without fully entering them, learning who controlled which lanes and which guards looked the other way. At that stage, his primary concern remained simple, which was avoiding trouble long enough to settle into his sentence. He did not yet carry the reputation of a killer, nor did he imagine himself becoming one. For a brief period, prison appeared to him as something he could endure, rather than something that would redefine him. By the end of 1977, Silverstein had adjusted to confinement in ways that alarmed him less than they should have. He accepted chains, counts, and searches as ordinary facts rather than temporary hardship. Letters from home grew infrequent, and connections to the outside world faded without drama. His world narrowed to the size of the tier, and his future narrowed to the length of his sentence. Everything that would later define his name still lay ahead of him, hidden inside choices he had not yet made. By 1978, the real currency inside USP Leavenworth was not commissary stamps or cigarettes, since the serious money moved through heroin, marijuana, and pills that slipped past fences. The Aryan Brotherhood controlled several of those lanes, using girlfriends, corrupt visitors, and pressured inmates to carry packages through visiting rooms and work details. Thomas Silverstein did not invent that system, yet he plugged into it fast, since protection always demanded contribution rather than loyalty alone. Every man who touched that pipeline knew one rule mattered more than any other, since refusal meant you became the next problem that needed solving. Inside that world, contracts were not signed on paper, and exit clauses did not exist once your name entered the ledger. Danny Atwell sat inside that same economy, serving time for bank robbery while earning favors by moving contraband for the Brotherhood's California clique. He dealt directly with Silverstein's circle, which included Edgar Heavily and Charles McAvoy, handling marijuana drops that passed inspection without drawing heat. Trouble started when Atwell refused to carry heroin, which brought longer sentences and heavier surveillance compared with weed. According to later testimony, Atwell told people he wanted no part of harder drugs, which, in prison logic, he sounded like betrayal rather than caution. From that point forward, his value shifted into liability, and that shift usually ended only one way. On February 17, 1979, guards found Danny Atwell dead inside USP Leavenworth, lying in his cell area with multiple stab wounds across his torso and neck. Prison officials sealed the range, pulled every inmate for questioning, and began building a case inside a place where truth moved more slowly than rumors. Word traveled through the tiers that Atwell had been handled for refusing an order, which fit perfectly into the Brotherhood's reputation for discipline. Within days, informants started whispering names, placing Silverstein, Heavla, and McAvoy at the center of the hit. Those whispers mattered more than fingerprints, since inside federal prison walls, testimony always outweighed physical evidence. One inmate later claimed he heard Silverstein tell Atwell to stay quiet while stabbing him, which became the line prosecutors repeated until it stuck in public memory. Another witness said Atwell worked for Silverstein's group and got killed when he balked at transporting heroin. Turning internal gossip into courtroom narrative, investigators leaned hard on jailhouse informants who faced their own sentences, offering small deals and protection in exchange for statements. Those men delivered exactly what prosecutors needed, placing Silverstein inside the killing and framing it as an Aryan Brotherhood execution. Inside prison culture, everybody knew informants lied for leverage, yet federal courtrooms still treated their words like sworn truth. The trial opened in 1980, with prosecutors painting Silverstein as a gang enforcer who ordered Atwell's death to protect a drug operation. They introduced his Aryan Brotherhood tattoo, his associations, and testimony from inmates who admitted trading statements for favors. Defense attorneys attacked credibility, pointing out inconsistencies, incentives, and shifting stories across interviews. None of that mattered to the jury, which heard a clean story about betrayal, discipline, and gang revenge. When the verdict came back guilty, the judge added a life sentence to Silverstein's existing 15-year term, erasing any realistic release date. Silverstein would later enter Marion's control unit, labeled as a convicted prison murderer, which changed how guards treated him and how inmates measured him. Inside that environment, reputation functioned as armor, and his new label gave him both fear and status he never asked for. The Bureau of Prisons moved him under tighter restrictions, cutting privileges and limiting movement more than before. What nobody mentioned during that transfer was how fragile the case really stood beneath the surface. Years later, appeals courts would confirm what many inmates already believed, which was that Atwell's trial rested on paid lies. When Thomas Silverstein arrived at USP Marion in late 1980, the building already carried a reputation that traveled faster than paperwork across the federal system. Marion was not just another penitentiary, since it functioned as the place where the Bureau of Prisons sent men they no longer knew how to manage. Every inmate housed there had already failed at other prisons, which meant every cell held someone who had crossed a final line. From the first day, Silverstein understood that Marion did not exist to rehabilitate anyone, since it existed to contain men the system considered permanently dangerous. The control unit sat at the center of that mission, built to isolate prisoners who threatened staff, inmates, or institutional order itself. Men inside those cells spent 23 hours each day, locked behind solid steel doors, leaving only for showers or solitary recreation under escort. Bright fluorescent lights stayed on around the clock, which meant darkness never came unless you learned to create it with closed eyes. Cameras covered every angle, guards logged every movement, and silence became the loudest sound a man learned to endure. In that space, time stopped behaving like time, since days blurred into months without landmarks to measure them. Silverstein entered the control unit carrying the weight of a murder conviction, an Aryan Brotherhood affiliation, and a reputation that made guards cautious before he spoke a single word. He received a cell at the end of a tier, where officers could watch him from multiple angles without standing too close. Every meal arrived through a narrow slot. Every count required visual confirmation, and every movement came with chains and orders. In that environment, behavior turned into currency. Since one mistake could cost what little privilege remained, even breathing wrong could move a man deeper into isolation. Inside Marion, the prison did not erase gang structures, since it compressed them into tighter and more dangerous forms. White inmates clustered with whites, black inmates aligned with their own sets, and every race watched every other race with practiced suspicion. The Aryan Brotherhood maintained a presence through men like Silverstein and Clayton Fountain, while black gangs like the DC Blacks held their own lines of influence. Every interaction passed through racial filters, and every misunderstanding carried the potential to become a killing. In that building, nobody believed violence came from impulse, since most violence arrived after weeks of quiet planning. Robert Chappelle entered that world as a known member of the DC Blacks, carrying a life sentence for killing a police officer in Washington, D.C. His reputation followed him through intake, and his gang affiliation placed him directly opposite the Aryan Brotherhood's interests, the DC. Blacks in the Aryan Brotherhood had clashed across multiple federal prisons, building a history of retaliation that did not require fresh provocation. When Chappelle reached Marion, both sides already understood that unfinished business traveled with him. In that unit, history never stayed in the past, since old grudges always found new chances. Tension grew not through shouting, but through routine, since men passed each other in chains, in showers, and in recreation cages without ever exchanging words. Guards separated movement carefully, yet rumors still slipped through vents, toilet pipes, and whispered conversations during medical runs. Silverstein heard quickly that the DC Blacks believed he had killed Danny Atwell as part of Brotherhood business, which mattered even after that conviction got overturned years later. Inside prison culture, acquittals did not erase reputation, since rumor carried more weight than court rulings. Once a man got labeled a killer, every rival treated him as one, regardless of paperwork. In 1981, Robert Chappelle was found dead inside Marion, strangled under circumstances that never became clean in public record. Investigators charged Silverstein and Clayton Fountain with the murder, arguing that it represented retaliation ordered by the Aryan Brotherhood against the DC Blacks. Silverstein denied involvement, claiming he had nothing to do with the killing and that the charge followed the same informant pattern as the Atwell case. Once again, jailhouse witnesses stepped forward, repeating stories that fit the narrative prosecutors needed. When the jury convicted him, another life sentence attached itself to a man who already had nowhere left to go. That conviction changed the temperature inside the control unit immediately, since the DC Blacks now saw Silverstein as a confirmed enemy rather than a suspected one. Raymond Cadillac Smith, the national leader of the DC Blacks, took personal responsibility for avenging Chappelle's death. When Smith transferred into Marion in 1982, every officer understood that a collision was coming, whether they intervened or not. According to Silverstein, guards placed Smith deliberately near him, believing one of them would solve the problem for the institution. Whether that claim was true or not, the outcome moved in that direction with frightening speed. From the moment Smith arrived, threats circulated through the tier without anyone needing to say them out loud. Silverstein later said Smith promised to kill him, while Smith believed Silverstein deserved death for Chappelle, regardless of his denials. The control unit became a narrow hallway of waiting, where both men measured distance, timing, and opportunity. Guards increased supervision, yet no supervision could erase the fact that both men lived within striking distance. In that environment, every escort, every shower run, and every recreation period became a potential execution site. The pressure inside Marion came not only from gang hatred, but from the structure of isolation itself. Men locked alone for 23 hours each day learned to replay insults, slights, and rumors until they became obsessions. Without conversation, imagination filled the silence, and imagination rarely chose peace. Small provocations expanded into life and death questions, since nothing else remained to focus on. Silverstein later said that isolation magnified every thought until anger felt larger than the cell that contained it. Inside that space, suspicion functioned like a weapon that required no hand to hold it. A glance, a rumor, or a guard's comment could become proof of betrayal in a man's mind. Inmates learned to interpret everything as threat, since assuming safety usually ended badly. Chappelle's death hardened those rules, teaching every gang member that preemption mattered more than patience. When survival depended on reputation, waiting often meant dying. By mid-1982, Marion had become a sealed battlefield, where no neutral ground existed and no conversation carried innocence. Guards watched carefully, yet even they admitted privately that the control unit operated more like a laboratory of violence than a correctional program. Silverstein and Fountain trained themselves physically inside their cells, running routines that prepared them for moments they believed were inevitable. Across the tier, Cadillac Smith did the same, building his own plan under the same roof. What made Marion especially dangerous was not only the violence, but the belief that violence solved problems administrators could not. When two men hated each other enough to kill, the institution often benefited from letting that hatred burn itself out. Silverstein later claimed that officers wanted either him or Smith dead, which would simplify management and remove a constant threat. Official reports denied that, yet the timing of Smith's placement never stopped raising questions. In that building, convenience and policy sometimes blurred in ways nobody wanted to document. The control unit did not need riots to produce death, since its design encouraged quiet, surgical killings instead. Isolation sharpened focus, limited witnesses, and gave killers time to plan without interruption. Men learned patience not as virtue, but as strategy, waiting weeks for a single opening. Every escort schedule, every door sequence, and every guard rotation became part of that calculus. In such a place, murder rarely came from emotion, since it usually came from method. By September 1982, the stage had been set completely, with Silverstein, Fountain, and Smith occupying the same locked world, without any buffer left between them. Administrators had not separated them, rumors had hardened into certainties, and both sides believed death was already scheduled. In that environment, survival stopped meaning avoiding trouble and started meaning striking first. Marion had created a system where conflict did not dissolve over time, since time only sharpened it. The control unit was supposed to neutralize danger through isolation, yet it often concentrated danger into tighter and more explosive forms. Men entered that space broken by prior prisons and left it either dead or more dangerous than when they arrived. Silverstein understood by then that Marion did not exist to correct behavior, since it existed to manage consequences after correction had already failed. Inside those walls, every mistake followed a man forever, and every accusation stayed lethal even after courts reversed it. By the fall of 1982, Thomas Silverstein no longer lived in a prison so much as inside a sealed equation, where gang loyalty, racial politics, and institutional design pointed toward only one solution. The building had taught him that in a world without exits, the only control left was timing. What came next would not surprise anyone who understood how Marion worked, since the control unit rarely produced peace for men already labeled beyond saving. The death of Robert Chappelle in 1981 changed Thomas Silverstein's standing inside the federal system in ways no overturned verdict could undo. Once investigators labeled him responsible for killing a DC Blacks member, Every file, transfer order, and classification review carried that assumption forward. Courts could reverse convictions, yet prisons never erased reputation, since administrators treated accusation as fact when measuring risk. From that point on, Silverstein moved through the system not as a suspect, but as a confirmed internal threat. In a place where labels defined survival, that distinction carried more weight than any legal nuance. Robert Chappelle had entered Marion with a life sentence for killing a police officer in Washington, D.C., which already placed him high on the hierarchy of feared inmates. He represented the D.C. Blacks, a gang that had clashed with the Aryan Brotherhood across multiple federal institutions for years. Those conflicts rarely needed fresh reasons, since old debts moved with men when chains moved them between prisons. When Chappelle died by strangulation inside Marion, officials immediately framed the killing as gang retaliation rather than personal dispute. In that environment, gang motive explained almost everything before evidence ever arrived. The prosecution relied again on inmate testimony, constructing a story that Silverstein and Clayton Fountain eliminated Chappelle on Brotherhood orders. Silverstein denied involvement, claiming he never touched Chappelle and never received such instructions. None of that stopped the machinery from moving, since juries in prison murder cases almost always believed informants over defendants with violent records. When the verdict came back guilty, Silverstein received another life sentence, stacking permanence onto permanence. By then, sentence length had stopped meaning anything except confirmation that he would die inside federal custody. That conviction traveled fast through inmate networks, reaching the D.C. Blacks long before it reached any appellate court. Raymond Cadillac Smith, the national leader of the D.C. Blacks, took the verdict personally, treating it as proof that Silverstein had murdered one of his people. Smith carried authority, experience, and a reputation for ordering killings rather than committing them himself. When word reached Marion that Smith would transfer into the control unit, every officer understood what that meant. They were placing two sworn enemies inside a locked space designed to amplify conflict rather than contain it. Smith arrived at Marion in 1982, escorted under heavy guard and placed in the same control unit as Silverstein and Fountain. Officials assigned him to a cell close enough for daily movement patterns to intersect. Silverstein later said guards knew exactly what they were doing, since separating the two men would have required only a different housing decision. According to him, officers wanted one of them to eliminate the other to simplify management. Official reports denied that claim, yet the placement itself never stopped raising suspicion among those who lived inside that system. From the first week, both men treated each other as active threats rather than distant enemies. Smith told associates he intended to kill Silverstein to avenge Chappelle's death. Silverstein said he tried to tell Smith that he never killed Chappelle, yet Smith dismissed every denial as manipulation. In prison logic, innocence rarely mattered once blood entered the equation. Every escort, every recreation run, and every shower movement became an opportunity both sides studied carefully. The control unit gave men time to think in ways normal life never allowed. 23 hours alone each day meant replaying threats, imagining attacks, and refining plans without interruption. Silverstein and Fountain used that time to train physically, building stamina through endless push-ups and sit-ups inside their cells. Smith did the same on his side of the tier, preparing himself for the moment he believed would settle the score. Guards increased supervision, yet supervision could not erase the fact that all three men remained within reach of each other. The opportunity came on September 27, 1982, during a routine movement that broke the normal separation pattern. Silverstein and Fountain managed to escape from their recreation area by manipulating door procedures that should not have failed. They carried homemade knives fashioned from prison metal, hidden long enough to pass multiple searches. When Cadillac Smith returned from a shower, still wet and unarmed, the two men rushed him without warning. What followed lasted seconds, yet carried consequences that lasted decades. Silverstein and Fountain stabbed Raymond Smith repeatedly, driving their blades into his torso, neck, and back until his body stopped moving. Medical reports later counted 67 stab wounds across his body, evidence of an attack that went far beyond ensuring death. Guards rushed toward the noise, yet arrived only after the killing had already finished. Inside the control unit, speed mattered more than response, since locked doors delayed intervention by design. By the time officers secured the area, Cadillac Smith lay dead on the concrete floor. What happened next shocked even veteran prison staff accustomed to violence. Instead of retreating to their cells, Silverstein and Fountain dragged Smith's body along the tier, pulling it past cell after cell. Inmates watched through narrow windows as the corpse left streaks of blood across the floor. The display served a clear purpose, since it announced to every rival that the Aryan Brotherhood had settled the debt publicly and without hesitation. Inside gang culture, such displays replaced speeches, warnings, and negotiations. The message traveled fast through Marion and beyond, reaching federal administrators within hours. Silverstein and Fountain had demonstrated that even the control unit could not prevent organized murder. Prosecutors charged both men with first-degree murder, adding yet another life sentence to Silverstein's record. At sentencing, judges described the killing as calculated, premeditated, and among the most brutal acts committed inside a federal prison. With that conviction, Silverstein's file crossed a threshold administrators rarely faced. From that moment forward, the Bureau of Prisons treated Silverstein as unmanageable by any normal standard. He had now been convicted of killing 2 inmates inside federal custody, both tied to gang retaliation rather than spontaneous violence. Standard segregation no longer seemed adequate, since segregation itself had produced the opportunity for murder. Every classification committee reviewing his case reached the same conclusion, which was that no existing unit could safely contain him among other inmates. The system had reached the limit of its usual tools. Guards began escorting Silverstein with more restraints, more officers, and tighter procedures than any other prisoner in Marion. Recreation times changed, movement schedules tightened, and doors stayed locked longer between transfers. None of that addressed the deeper problem, which was that isolation had not prevented violence, but had sharpened it. Silverstein now lived as proof that the most restrictive unit in the federal system still failed at its core mission. Inside the control unit, inmates began referring to him as someone beyond normal categories, neither leader nor soldier, but a man who killed inside the place designed to stop killing. Officers spoke of him as a special case that required special handling. Even when policy offered no clear guidance, administrators quietly acknowledged that the control unit itself had become part of the problem rather than the solution. By killing Cadillac Smith, Silverstein had exposed a structural failure no amount of paperwork could hide. The murder forced the Bureau of Prisons to confront a question it had avoided for years, which was how to control inmates who continued killing after every privilege disappeared. Courts could not execute him, sentences could not deter him, and segregation had not contained him. In that vacuum, administrators began designing a new category of punishment that went beyond ordinary solitary confinement. Silverstein's case became the blueprint for what that punishment would become. By the end of 1982, Thomas Silverstein no longer represented just a dangerous inmate, but a systemic crisis. His file now documented 3 prison murder convictions, 2 of them upheld, all committed inside maximum security conditions. The institution could no longer pretend that ordinary management applied to him. What came next would not involve another prison transfer so much as the invention of a new form of confinement built around his existence. After the killing of Cadillac Smith, the control unit at Marion entered a phase that administrators later described as permanent emergency. Movement schedules tightened, escort teams doubled, and officers received new instructions to treat every contact as a potential ambush. Into that atmosphere stepped Officer Merle Clutts, a 42-year-old correctional officer assigned to bring order back to a tier that had just watched a man dragged to death. Klutz carried a reputation for strict discipline, precise procedure, and zero tolerance for manipulation. From his first weeks on the unit, he made it clear that the rules would no longer bend for anyone. Klutz changed routines that inmates had learned to rely on, adjusting escort timing, altering search procedures, and enforcing regulations that others had allowed to slide. He confiscated personal items that violated policy, including drawings Silverstein had created inside his cell. Silverstein later said Klutz tore up several of those drawings during a cell search, treating them as contraband rather than expression. Whether that act followed policy or crossed into harassment never became fully clear. Yet inside Silverstein's mind, it registered as deliberate provocation. In a world where property served as identity, destroying art felt like erasing the last thing that belonged to him. Over the following months, Silverstein began interpreting every interaction with Klutz through the same lens. When Klutz reassigned him to a different cell, Silverstein saw punishment rather than procedure. When Klutz enforced handcuff protocols more tightly, Silverstein read humiliation rather than safety. He later claimed Klutz taunted him verbally during escorts, calling him names and threatening harsher restrictions. Internal investigations would later say no evidence supported those claims, yet perception mattered more than proof inside a locked cell. Isolation magnified those perceptions in ways few outside prison ever experience. 23 hours each day alone meant replaying every exchange until small slights grew into fixed beliefs. Without conversation to correct him, Silverstein's interpretation hardened into certainty. He began writing grievances that went nowhere, filing complaints that administrators dismissed as routine manipulation. Each rejection reinforced the idea that official channels would never protect him from what he saw as abuse. By early 1983, Klutz had become the center of Silverstein's internal world. Other guards faded into background noise, while Klutz stood as the symbol of everything he believed the system was doing to him. Silverstein later said that hatred did not arrive suddenly, but grew through repetition, through weeks of imagining confrontations that never happened. In that mental space, revenge stopped feeling emotional and started feeling logical. He began treating the idea of killing Klutz as a problem that needed solving rather than a crime that needed resisting. Planning replaced impulse with method. Silverstein studied escort routines, door sequences, and guard positions with the same discipline he once applied to robberies on the street. He counted steps between cells, measured how long handcuffs stayed locked, and memorized which officers stood where during movements. The control unit gave him no distractions, only time to refine details. In isolation, revenge matured slowly, shaped by repetition rather than rage. During that period, he began speaking quietly with Randy Gometz, an inmate housed nearby with a reputation for intelligence and patience. Gometz understood prison mechanics and had already shown skill in fabricating tools. Silverstein approached him cautiously, framing the idea not as murder but as self-defense before future harm arrived. Gometz listened, asked questions, and gradually agreed to help. Their partnership formed not through excitement but through calculation, built over weeks of low-volume conversations through vents and door slots. Together, they designed a plan that relied on procedure rather than luck. Gometz began shaping a handcuff key from scrap metal, filing it carefully until it could unlock standard restraints. He also helped fashion a shank thin enough to hide during searches, yet strong enough to pierce bone. Silverstein practiced unlocking cuffs in his cell using mock restraints, timing how long the motion took with his hands behind his back. Every rehearsal focused on minimizing seconds, since seconds meant life or death in a corridor full of armed officers. They chose a moment that occurred almost daily, which was the escort to showers when inmates moved past multiple cells under guard control. During those escorts, officers briefly paused outside certain cells to check conditions or adjust chains. That pause created the opening Silverstein needed, since it brought him within reach of Gometz's door. The plan required Gometz to unlock the cuffs and pass the weapon in one fluid movement without alerting any officer. After that, Silverstein would attack before anyone understood what had happened. Throughout the summer of 1983, Silverstein refined the plan in silence. He did not boast, threaten, or test limits in ways that might alert staff. Instead, he behaved well, filed fewer grievances, and avoided confrontations that could bring attention. Guards began describing him as calmer, which later struck some as deeply ironic. In truth, discipline had not reduced his anger, but had hidden it more effectively. By September, he believed the plan was ready, and he began waiting for the right escort team and the right positioning. He paid attention to which officers led which movements, and how Klutz positioned himself relative to other guards. He noted that Klutz often walked slightly ahead of the group, placing himself between Silverstein and the trailing officers. That habit mattered more than any weapon, since it created isolation inside the escort itself. In his later statements, Silverstein said he no longer felt fear during that period, only focus. He claimed the decision to kill Klutz had already been made, leaving only execution of the plan. He described the process as crossing a line in his own mind, where reversal no longer existed. From that point forward, every day served only as rehearsal for a single moment. By October 1983, the control unit had returned to routine on the surface, yet beneath that routine, a murder plan waited for a procedural mistake. Guards believed tighter discipline had restored order, unaware that discipline itself had supplied the blueprint for what came next. Silverstein and Gometz continued their quiet preparation, speaking only when necessary and hiding tools where searches would not reach. The morning of October 22nd, 1983 began like hundreds of others inside the control unit at USP Marion, with lights switching on at the same hour and officers preparing the same escort lists. Silverstein rose from his bunk without hurry, dressed in standard issue clothing, and waited for the sound of keys that marked movement time. Guards assembled the escort team, with Officer Merle Clutts positioned in front, 2 officers behind, and Silverstein cuffed with his hands secured behind his back. Nothing in that lineup looked different from the routine that had governed the unit for months. In a place built on repetition, sameness was the strongest camouflage a plan could have. As the escort moved down the concrete corridor, Silverstein kept his eyes forward and his pace steady, matching Klutz' stride step for step. They passed cell after cell, metal doors sealed, inmates watching through narrow windows as another body moved through chains. The group slowed as they approached Randy Gometz's cell, following the same pattern used during dozens of earlier escorts. Klutz paused briefly to check positioning, which placed Silverstein directly beside Gometz's door for the few seconds the plan required. That pause, which meant nothing to the officers, meant everything to the two men waiting for it. Inside the cell, Gometz had already positioned himself close to the door with the handmade key hidden in his palm. When Klutz stopped, Gometz slipped the key through the cuff mechanism and turned it once without looking up. The metal opened with a soft click that blended into the noise of the corridor, and Silverstein felt the restraint loosen behind his back. In the same motion, Gometz passed him the thin blade, sliding it into his hand where no one could see it. The exchange took less than 2 seconds, yet those seconds had taken months to engineer. Silverstein did not hesitate once the weapon reached his grip, since hesitation had been trained out of the plan long before that morning. He turned slightly toward Klutz, stepped forward, and drove the blade into the officer's chest. Klutz reacted instinctively, turning toward the movement and raising his arms, yet the first wound had already broken his balance. Silverstein struck again, aiming for the neck and upper torso, keeping his movements compact and controlled. The attack lasted only moments, since speed mattered more than force in a hallway full of armed men. The two trailing officers froze for an instant, then rushed forward as Klutz fell backward onto the floor. Silverstein dropped the weapon immediately and raised his hands, offering no resistance as they pushed him against the wall and secured his cuffs again. Blood spread across the concrete as officers called for medical help and emergency response teams flooded the tier. Klutz remained conscious briefly, speaking a few words before losing strength. He died minutes later from his wounds, becoming the first federal correctional officer murdered by an inmate since 1963. Silverstein did not struggle, shout, or attempt escape after the attack, since surrender had always been part of the design. He allowed himself to be led away without argument, knowing that resistance would only add chaos to a moment already complete. Investigators later noted his calm demeanor, describing him as composed rather than emotional. In his later statements, he said the plan had ended exactly where it was supposed to end. The months of preparation had reduced the act itself to a brief execution of steps. While administrators rushed to secure Marion, the day had not yet finished delivering consequences. Later that same afternoon, Clayton Fountain attacked another officer, Lieutenant Robert Hoffman, during a separate escort inside the control unit. Fountain stabbed Hoffman multiple times, leaving him severely wounded but alive after emergency surgery. Investigators concluded that Fountain had acted independently, believing the killing of Klutz signaled the moment to strike. In the span of hours, Marion had lost one officer and nearly lost another, exposing a collapse of control no policy had anticipated. News of the attacks traveled quickly beyond the prison walls, reaching Washington before the day ended. Newspapers across the country ran headlines announcing the murder of a federal guard inside the nation's most secure penitentiary. Attorney General William French Smith issued statements calling the attacks an assault on the authority of the federal government itself. Members of Congress demanded explanations, while the Bureau of Prisons ordered immediate reviews of escort procedures nationwide. For the first time, officials acknowledged publicly that their highest security prison had failed at its central purpose. Within days, administrators placed Marion under permanent lockdown, suspending all inmate movement outside cells. Showers, recreation, and programs ended, replaced by 24-hour isolation that lasted for years. The prison effectively became the nation's first modern supermax, though the term had not yet been invented. Officials argued that only total immobilization could prevent further killings. What had begun as a response to one attack became a new model for extreme confinement across the federal system. The killings forced the Bureau of Prisons to rethink how it handled inmates classified as uncontrollable. Escort protocols changed, handcuff designs were reviewed, and movement patterns across federal prisons were rewritten. Yet the deeper change came in philosophy rather than procedure. Administrators began planning facilities designed around permanent isolation, where inmates like Silverstein would never again move past another cell. Those plans would eventually produce ADX Florence in Colorado, a prison built specifically for men the system no longer trusted with proximity. October 22, 1983 marked the moment when ordinary segregation would give way to a new era of confinement. Before that day, officials believed that isolation units could manage even the most dangerous inmates. After that day, they accepted that isolation itself might produce the very violence it was meant to prevent. Silverstein's attack exposed a contradiction no policy could hide, which was that control units could not eliminate human calculation. In a system built on procedure, one procedural pause had been enough to change everything. By the time night fell on Marion, the institution no longer resembled the prison it had been the day before. Guards walked with heavier weapons, administrators spoke of permanent lockdown, and inmates understood that the last remnants of movement freedom were gone. The death of Merle Clutts had not only ended one life, but had rewritten the future of federal imprisonment. What followed would shape how the United States confined its most dangerous prisoners for decades to come. After October 22, 1983, The Bureau of Prisons treated USP Marion not as a prison in crisis, but as a warning that the old system had reached its limit. Administrators ordered an immediate and indefinite lockdown, sealing every inmate inside his cell for 24 hours each day. Showers stopped, recreation ended, programs vanished, and movement across the institution dropped to zero. What had begun as an emergency measure hardened into permanent policy within weeks. Marion became the first federal prison in modern history to operate under full lockdown without a scheduled end. That lockdown did not last months but years, continuing in different forms well into the 1990s. Inmates received meals through slots, medical care through cell doors, and exercise only when escorted in restraints to small cages. Officials described the policy as necessary to restore control after the murder of a guard. Critics described it as collective punishment imposed on hundreds of men for the actions of a few. Inside the Bureau of Prisons, Marion became the testing ground for a new philosophy of confinement based on immobilization rather than management. The political response moved quickly. Attorney General William French Smith and senior Justice Department officials demanded a system that could contain men like Silverstein permanently. Congressional hearings questioned whether any existing prison could safely house inmates who continued killing under maximum security. Wardens testified that segregation units failed once inmates adapted to them. The conclusion that emerged quietly inside policy circles was that the federal system needed something beyond segregation. It needed a prison designed for permanent isolation. Planning for that concept began almost immediately. Architects and administrators studied European isolation prisons and older American experiments with solitary confinement. The idea took shape around cells that allowed no human contact, no group movement, and no opportunity for coordinated action. This future facility would not correct behavior, but would prevent behavior altogether through distance and control. Silverstein's file became the central case study used to justify that design. His history demonstrated that even the harshest units still allowed violence to occur. In the short term, officials faced a more immediate question, which was where to place Silverstein now that Marion had failed to contain him. Standard segregation no longer seemed adequate, and moving him to another penitentiary risked repeating the same pattern. Administrators decided to remove him entirely from the normal prison population and place him under conditions no other inmate had experienced. The goal was not punishment alone, but prevention through absolute separation. In early 1983, after the Klutz murder, the Bureau of Prisons transferred Silverstein to the federal penitentiary in Atlanta under extraordinary security. He arrived under heavy escort, moved through empty corridors, and placed in a specially prepared isolation cell far from other inmates. Officials ordered that he have no physical contact with any prisoner and minimal contact with staff. From that day forward, every movement would involve chains, multiple officers, and closed corridors. The system had chosen to solve the problem by removing him from human proximity altogether. That transfer marked the beginning of what administrators called total isolation. Unlike segregation, which still allowed limited interaction, this new status eliminated all inmate contact. Silverstein would eat alone, exercise alone, shower alone, and live alone without seeing another prisoner's face. Guards communicated through doors and cameras rather than direct conversation. In internal memos, officials described the placement as experimental, acknowledging they had no precedent for such confinement. They were inventing a new category of imprisonment around a single man. By the time the transfer completed, the Bureau of Prisons had quietly accepted that Silverstein would never again live in a normal prison environment. His existence now shaped policy rather than fitting within it. Marion remained locked down. Planning for a supermax facility advanced, and a new era of American incarceration began without any formal declaration. The system had answered violence with architecture, procedure, and silence. What followed would test not only Silverstein's endurance, but the limits of human isolation itself. When Thomas Silverstein entered isolation in Atlanta, the cell measured roughly 6 feet by 8 feet, built of concrete, steel, and sealed edges that left nowhere to hide from observation. The door contained a narrow window reinforced with thick glass, behind which cameras watched every movement without blinking. Lights remained on at all hours, creating a permanent artificial day that erased any sense of night. The cell held a steel bed, a thin mattress, a combination sink and toilet, and nothing else that could be moved or altered. From the first hour, the environment communicated a single message, which was that this space existed to erase stimulation rather than provide it. Guards removed his clothing when he arrived, issuing only a paper gown for weeks at a time. That policy reflected fear rather than punishment, since administrators worried he might fashion weapons from fabric or attempt self-harm. Meals arrived through a slot in the door, placed on plastic trays that never entered his hands directly. Conversation did not occur, since guards limited speech to commands and responses required by procedure. Cameras recorded continuously, storing footage that supervisors reviewed daily. In that cell, privacy did not exist even in theory. Days blended into each other without markers, since isolation erased the difference between weekdays and weekends. Without human voices, time slowed in ways Silverstein later struggled to describe. He counted meals, counted footsteps in the corridor, and counted the number of times guards checked the window each hour. Sleep came irregularly, broken by lights and noise from ventilation systems that never shut down. Within months, the hardest enemy was no longer violence, but monotony. After extended evaluation, psychologists warned administrators that complete sensory deprivation risked mental collapse. In response, officials introduced limited privileges designed not for comfort, but for stability. Silverstein received paper, pencils, and permission to draw under supervision. That decision marked the beginning of a routine that would define the rest of his life. Drawing replaced violence as his primary activity, giving structure to days that otherwise had none. Over time, he developed a daily schedule that functioned as self-imposed discipline. He exercised in his cell using push-ups, sit-ups, and pacing routines measured by footsteps. He meditated to control anger and manage racing thoughts. Borrowing techniques from books guards allowed him to read. Drawing sessions filled long afternoons, producing hundreds of images that he later sent to supporters outside. Those routines did not make isolation bearable, yet they made it survivable. Administrators eventually modified his cell into what became known internally as the Silverstein Suite. They added a slightly larger exercise area, enclosed by steel mesh, allowing him to walk in small circles under constant camera supervision. The suite included multiple locked doors, pressure sensors, and redundant security systems designed specifically around his history. No other inmate in the federal system lived under such conditions. His confinement had become a permanent engineering project rather than a custodial assignment. As years passed, violence faded as a daily concern, replaced by the slow erosion of time. Without enemies nearby, without movement, and without opportunity, aggression had nowhere to go. Silverstein later said that anger burned out from lack of oxygen, leaving behind exhaustion rather than rage. His battles shifted from survival against rivals to survival against boredom, depression, and memory. In isolation, the mind turned inward in ways no prison fight ever required. He marked years by birthdays, by court filings, and by the occasional letter from supporters who had learned his name through litigation and journalism. Relationships outside prison replaced relationships inside, built through writing rather than conversation. He followed legal battles, challenging his confinement, studying court opinions as if they were maps to a future that might never arrive. In that cell, hope became an abstract concept rather than a plan. Time replaced violence as the dominant force shaping his life. Days no longer threatened him with death, but with repetition. The discipline that once prepared him for killing now prepared him for endurance. Guards noticed that incidents declined, reports grew shorter, and his behavior stabilized into routine compliance. The man who once reshaped federal prisons through violence now reshaped himself through stillness. In November 1987, the federal penitentiary in Atlanta became the stage for an uprising no one had prepared for, when Cuban detainees awaiting immigration decisions seized control of large sections of the prison. The riot began after courts ruled that many of the Marion Cubans would not receive asylum, triggering anger that spread faster than alarms could contain. Inmates overpowered guards, took hostages, and set fires that filled cell blocks with smoke and panic. Administrators lost control within hours, turning the prison into a battlefield of barricades and negotiations. In the middle of that chaos, officials faced an unusual problem, which was what to do with Thomas Silverstein, who remained sealed in total isolation while the rest of the institution burned. They feared that leaving him locked inside a collapsing building risked his death or escape. They also feared that releasing him into a riot risked turning disorder into massacre. After emergency meetings, they made a decision that contradicted every rule they had written for his confinement. They opened his cell and moved him out of isolation for the first time in years. Silverstein emerged into corridors filled with smoke, shouting, and armed inmates who barely recognized him. Guards placed him under heavy escort and moved him through areas controlled by rioters, unsure whether he would attack, flee, or exploit the moment. Officials later admitted they expected violence the instant he reached open space. Instead, he followed orders, stayed close to his escorts, and asked only where he was being taken. After years of isolation, he walked through chaos without raising his voice. During the standoff, negotiators used Silverstein as a contingency asset, believing his reputation might intimidate detainees if talks failed. The FBI eventually negotiated a peaceful surrender, and Silverstein returned to isolation without incident. Later, he told interviewers that he had spared a guard during that week when opportunity existed. That anecdote became important not as proof of mercy, but as evidence that time had altered his instincts. For the first time, officials considered that isolation had changed him more than it had broken him. By the late 1980s, Thomas Silverstein's confinement had become a legal case rather than a custodial decision. Civil rights attorneys filed lawsuits arguing that his isolation violated the Eighth Amendment prohibition against cruel and unusual punishment. They described years without human contact, constant light, and total surveillance as psychological torture rather than security. Psychiatrists testified that prolonged solitary confinement produced hallucinations, depression, and irreversible cognitive harm. For the first time, a federal court had to decide whether absolute isolation crossed a constitutional line. The Bureau of Prisons defended its policy by presenting Silverstein's history as proof that no lesser measure could protect staff or inmates. Officials testified that he had killed 3 men inside federal custody and attempted to kill guards even after extreme segregation. They argued that his confinement was not punishment, but necessity, imposed only after every alternative failed. Courts accepted that argument repeatedly, ruling that his isolation was justified by exceptional danger. Each decision reinforced the idea that some prisoners existed outside ordinary constitutional protections. Public debate followed those rulings, splitting opinion between those who saw isolation as torture and those who saw it as the only defense against men who killed without restraint. Journalists wrote profiles describing a man buried alive in concrete. Former guards wrote memoirs describing fear that no policy could manage. Academics began citing Silverstein's case in arguments against supermax prisons. His name became shorthand for the moral limits of punishment. Inside his cell, Silverstein began writing extensively about isolation, describing sensory deprivation, distorted time, and the slow erosion of memory. He argued that isolation did not prevent violence, but postponed it by crushing the mind. His essays circulated among activists, lawyers, and prison reform groups, reframing him not as a killer, but as a witness to institutional excess. Over time, the violent inmate became a reluctant critic of the system that had built itself around him. By the 1990s, his case influenced lawsuits challenging supermax prisons across the country. Courts cited his confinement as both precedent and warning, depending on the judge. Administrators admitted privately that his isolation raised questions no regulation could fully answer. The system had created a man it no longer knew how to punish or release. In that tension, American corrections found its most uncomfortable mirror. In 2005, the Bureau of Prisons transferred Thomas Silverstein to ADX Florence in Colorado, the supermax prison designed using lessons drawn directly from his case. There he lived under similar conditions, older, weaker, and no longer violent. Age replaced danger as his defining characteristic, while isolation remained unchanged. Guards who met him late in life described a quiet man who spoke softly and followed rules. In 2019, after complications from heart surgery, Thomas Silverstein died in federal custody at the age of 67. His death ended the longest continuous solitary confinement in American history. Reactions came from every corner of the system he had shaped. Former wardens said his case forced them to confront the limits of control. Advocates said his confinement proved that the state could lose its humanity in the name of safety. Harley Lappin, a former director of the Bureau of Prisons, later admitted publicly that keeping Silverstein in isolation for decades had been a mistake. He said the system had gone too far, driven by fear rather than evidence. That admission came too late to change anything for the man whose life had become a policy experiment. What remains is a question no court ever answered cleanly. Did the system contain a monster, or did it help create one through design and neglect? Did isolation prevent future violence, or did it teach a man that only violence mattered? Thomas Silverstein died alone, but the structure built around him remains active across the country. The unresolved problem is not what he did, but what the system learned from doing it to him.